Dear students, viewers and the subscribers, welcome to the IAS Mentor. This is our lecture number 6 in our series Indian Polity, and as already stated, the objective of this particular series is to provide a broader framework about the subject Indian polity and Indian Constitution. And apart from that, we'll also cover some of the important books which is relevant for the examination, which includes books like LAXMIKANTH, D.D BASU, which will also be comprehensively covered. And this series is not only useful for the students preparing for UPSC IAS examination, but also for other competitive examinations like the State Public Service Commissions. So what we have been understanding till this point of time is we have been trying to understand some of the basic concepts like what is a constitution and then we try to understand basically about the Constituent Assembly of India, which was the body that drafted the Indian Constitution. And after that we entered into a topic of what is called as historical background. So historical background is basically those areas as to what happened before the Constituent Assembly was established, or to be very specific, what are the various developments that has happened over a period of time that led to gradual constitutional development, which also includes as to how the Constituent Assembly was established and which later drafted the Indian Constitution. And basically it includes all those things right from the advent of Britishers into India, initially as traders and then subsequently as the rulers, and most importantly those developments that has happened when they started ruling India. And that phase when the Britishers ruled India after they colonized India was broadly divided into two phases, which we already learned. One is the company rule and other is the crown rule. And what are the major changes that has happened during the company rule? We have already completed that, starting the Regulating Act of 1773 till the Charter Act of 1853, which in fact continued till 1857. And in the last class we started about the company rule, about the crown rule, which started from 1858, right from the Regulating Act of 1858, it continued till 1947. And there are major developments that has happened during the crown rule, which includes the Government of India Act 1858, which majorly transferred the government, or which majorly transferred the authority to govern India from the East India Company directly to the British Crown. And in fact, for that purpose, they also provided for what is called as a Secretary of State. And then we have also seen three important Council Act that has been passed, majorly to bring reforms in the Legislative Council as well as the Executive Council, through the Council Act of 1861, then the Council Act of 1892, and then the Council Act of 1909. So gradually the British administration in India was becoming responsible in nature. That was a gradual development. And then the next stage of development, which you are going to see today, is the Government of India Act 1919 and the Government of India Act 1935, which brought in broader changes as to how India was ruled by the Britishers. And of course, after we see the Government of India Act 1919 and the Government of India Act 1935, we will also see the Indian Independence Act, by which India became an independent state, by which the Britishers gave independence to India on 15th August 1947. So we'll try to cover all these three legislations or all these three acts today in lecture number 6. So we'll just move on to the first act as a part of this particular lecture, is what is called as the Government of India Act 1919. So what is a major objective during the entire era of Crown Rule is basically they wanted to make the administration more responsible. And to make the administration more responsible, they wanted to provide more association of Indians in the administration. So as we have seen the gradual expansion of the Legislative Council and the Executive Council where the Indians were associated, the Government of India Act 1919 also had the objective of making the administration more responsible and increasing the association of the Indian members in the administration. But however, apart from the general objective, there were certain specific reforms that has been brought in the Government of India Act 1919. And one major thing that has happened is the separation of central and the provincial subjects. So you can look at here. What does it mean by demarcation or separation of the central as well as the provincial subjects, which is also technically what is called as the devolution of rules? That means what happened by the Government of India Act 1919? The Government of India Act 1919 transferred some of the powers which it had to the provincial legislature. It also transferred some of the powers to the provincial executives. That means at the center we had the viceroy, and then he had his own legislature and the executives. So some of the law making powers from the central legislature was transferred to the provincial legislature, some of the subjects. And some of the executive functions similarly has been transferred from the central executive, that is from the viceroy and his council, to the provincial executives, that is to the respective governors and their councils. So this is the first thing that has happened, and to that extent you can understand some of the central subjects and somewhere the provincial subjects. So initially the power was centralized, and we also seen that this phase of the crown rule was also what is called as gradually they were decentralizing the powers. In the line of decentralizing powers, some of the subjects were transferred to the provincial subjects, and the central legislature or the viceroy themselves retained certain powers, and some were transferred to the provincial legislatures. So what are the central subjects which were retained by the central legislature or by the viceroy? Is the areas like defense, foreign affairs, communication, civil and criminal procedure. So in these areas, still who will be supposed to make the law? It is only the central legislature, and they will also have the executive authority over them. That means they will make laws and they will implement. That means who is supposed to make laws related to the defense of India or the foreign relations of British India at that point of time? It is only the central legislature, and they will also execute. The central executives will also execute those things. But at the same time, they transferred some of the powers to the provincial legislature. And what were the subjects that were transferred to the provincial legislature? We have already seen a lot of provinces were there. Say for example, the Madras province was there, the Bombay province was there, and then subsequently the Punjab province was also there. So all these provinces were given certain subject matters on which they can make laws, which includes areas like public health, on education, local self-government, areas like agriculture. These powers were given to them. But however, this was only what is called as by a way of devolution of rules. That means basically the authority would be still with the central legislature or the viceroy, and the viceroy can still give this power to them, and whenever he wants it, he can take this power back. It is not guaranteed under the act that these powers will be definitely there with the provinces, which only later happened by the Government of India Act 1935. And that is why we say that the Government of India Act 1935 provided for what is called as a federal provision for the first time. But although in 1919 the powers were given to the provinces, it was not by a way of decentralization, it was only by a way of a devolution. So try to remember this, very, very important. UPSC has many times asked this particular question: when for the first time the decentralization happened, or when for the first time the federal provisions were introduced during the British India? So the answer is very clear, that was only in the Government of India Act 1935. So Government of India Act 1919 only provide for devolution of powers. So that is not a permanent power that may be given to the provinces. So apart from that, the provinces can make their own budget as per the Government of India Act 1919, and the central legislature can make their own budget. And most important development that has happened during the Government of India Act 1919 is also they brought in a system of what is called as diarchy. So diarchy means a dual system of government or a dual system. That is basically what is called as diarchy. So let us try to understand as to what this particular principle of diarchy. So by introducing this particular system of diarchy, so this itself can be asked as an examination: when was the principle of diarchy introduced? The principle of diarchy was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919. So now the next question is, what is the principle of this diarchy? Now before we understand as to what is diarchy, now try to understand. The first thing is, in the Government of India Act 1919, the subjects were broadly divided into two. One is to the central subjects and to the provincial subjects. Now what happened, whatever subjects that were given to the provinces, say for example the subjects like public health, education, local government, agriculture, they were, and along with that certain other subjects were also given to the provinces. And on top of that, there was a system of diarchy. Now, before we understand diarchy, understand this, that in every province there was a governor, and that governor had his own council. And apart from that, by this time, the Government of India Act 1919 also introduced a system of direct elections. You'll have to understand, when was a system of direct election introduced? It was in the Government of India Act 1919. Now, till this point of time, there was only indirect elections. Now, direct elections has been introduced. By direct elections, some responsible representatives of the people were also elected, and some of them also become ministers. That means some of them also become the executives. So, with this backdrop, let us try to understand as to what is this principle of diarchy. So, whatever the subject matter that was given to the provinces, they were further divided into what is called as reserved items and probably transferred items, or reserved subjects and transferred subjects. So, first of all, certain subjects were given to the provinces, and those subjects were further divided into what is called as reserved subjects and transferred subjects. And then on top of that, I also said that in every province there was a governor and he had his own council, and in that council there were also some of the Indian representatives who were elected and they were appointed as ministers. So, with this knowledge, if you try to understand as to what is a reserved subject and what is a transferred subject. Reserved subjects are those subjects which are very, very important from the Britishers' point of view. Say, for example, some of the matters like revenue, land revenue, police, electricity, industrial disputes, public services, these are all considered to be what is called as the reserved subjects. So, reserved subjects are those subjects where the governor will have control through his executives. Whereas on the other hand, there were something which is called as the transferred subjects. What are these transferred subjects? The transferred subjects were to be given to the Indian ministers, who are also part of the governor executive, but however, they were all elected by the people and then thereby they become the executives. Not all the executives in the governor council were elected. So basically, there were a lot of officials from the government who were also directly appointed by the government. So the governor is to directly control certain subjects which were part of what is called as the reserved subjects, and those are all important for the Britishers. But whereas for the Britishers there were certain subjects which was not important subject matters, and those subject matters were considered to be what is called as transferred subjects, and these transferred subjects are to be administered by a responsible Indian minister. That is basically what is called as the reserved items as well as the transferred items. So, you can understand here, see the transferred subjects. Subjects like education, public health, industries, agriculture, local government. You might see that these subjects are important. Okay, these subjects are important, but it is important for a welfare state. But when the Britishers are ruling India, they were not looking for the welfare of the people. So, those subjects which were really dealing with the welfare of the people, they were given in the hands of the responsible ministers. But whereas for them, those subjects which were important is especially to control the people, to collect the revenue, those subjects were kept in the control of what is called as the governor himself. And he exercised the power through his council and not the elected ministers. So, this is basically what is called as a system of diarchy. But however, this particular system of diarchy was a complete failure, because the responsible minister who is to take care of the transferred subjects is completely dependent upon the governor and his government, the governor, for the revenue to run out the administration in these areas, and the revenues are not coming properly, hence the system completely failed. So, this is the basic understanding you should have with regard to what is called as reserved subjects, transferred subjects. Reserved subjects are those reserved for the governor. Transferred subjects are those which were given in the hands of the responsible ministers, but ultimately the system was a complete failure anyways. So, this is basically what is called as a system of diarchy. And apart from the system of diarchy, an other development that has happened by the Government of India Act 1919 is also introduction of what is called as bicameralism. This is very, very important. What do you understand by bicameralism? Bicameralism means having two houses. Say, for example, today, as per the Constitution of India, we have bicameralism. We have the Lok Sabha also, we have the Rajya Sabha also, and that's basically what is called as bicameralism. Where was this genesis for the central legislature? It was there in the Government of India Act 1919, and they introduced two houses. One is what is called as the Council of States, and other is what is called as the Central Legislative Assembly. The Central Legislative Assembly at that point of time was similar to that of the Lok Sabha today, and the Council of States at that point of time was similar to that of the Rajya Sabha today. So this is basically what you'll have to understand. And apart from that, very important, the most or the majority of the members to these houses, that is both to the Central Legislative Assembly and to the Council of States, were to be elected by a direct election. So the principle of direct election, as I already said, was also brought in. So till this point of time, if you see what are the major developments that has happened in the Government of India Act 1919, well, the general objective is that they wanted to bring in more representation of the Indians in the system of governance. That is true. But specifically, they have brought in certain changes. One is that they have demarcated the subject between the central list as well as the state list. Certain items to the central legislature and the central government, certain items to the states. And apart from that, they also introduced what is called as a system of diarchy. Diarchy means whatever items or the subject matters that was given to the provinces were further divided into what is called as reserved and transferred subjects. For your easy understanding, you can understand reserved subjects are those subjects which are important for the Britishers. Transferred subjects are those subjects which are not important to them, so they transferred it to the Indian minister who was elected directly. And to that extent, you can understand that the Government of India Act 1919 also brought in a system of direct election. And apart from that, they also brought in a system of what is called as bicameralism. So bicameralism for the first time introduced in what is called as the Government of India Act 1919. I said that there was a system of direct election in the Government of India Act 1919, but this system of direct election was not based on the principle of universal adult franchise. Or in other words, not every adult individual was given the right to vote, but whereas it was based on the principle of what is called as limited adult franchise. That means only a limited number of people were given the right to vote depending upon various criteria. Depending upon some of the criteria like the property they owned, their educational qualification, their status, depending upon all these things, a limited franchise was given, and only they were eligible to vote to elect the members to the respective legislative body. So this is something that you'll have to keep in your mind. So I'm just repeating it. Although there was a system of election, direct election, but it was on the principle of what is called as limited adult franchise. And another important development that has happened during the Government of India Act 1919 is they expanded the scope of what is called as communal electorate. So we have seen in the last class itself that the communal electorate was introduced by the Government of the Indian Council Act 1909. And if you remember, you can put this in the comment box, who was considered to be the father of communal electorate in India, which we have learned in the last class. So 1919 introduced the system of communal electorate, but it has introduced a system of communal electorate only for the Muslims, that only the Muslim voters can eligible to vote and elect the Muslim candidates. But however, that concept of communal electorate was further expanded. So the Britishers were expanding their concept of divide and rule, which was further extended to the other communities as well. Say for example, they extended that to the Sikhs as well, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans. For all those people, the system of communal electorate was extended. And one more new development that has happened in the Government of India Act 1919 is more members were included into the Viceroy's Executive Council. Now try to understand. For the first time, an Indian was introduced into the Viceroy Executive Council by the Government of by the Indian Councils Act 1909. And we have seen it was Satyendra Prasad Sinha, who was the first member who was introduced into the Viceroy Executive Council. So that was further extended, and now 3 members from the Indians were introduced into the Viceroy Executive Council. And other major development that has happened during the Government of India Act 1919 is also establishment of what is called as the Public Service Commission. The Government of India Act 1919 provided for 2 Public Service Commission. One is for the center, that is the you can see it here, the Central Public Service Commission, and for every province there was what is called as a Provincial Public Service Commission. So that is basically you will have to understand. Now this Public Service Commission is the genesis of what we have it today. which is also renamed as what is the Union Public Service Commission for the center, and for every state they have what is called as the State Public Service Commission. Apart from this, the Government of India Act 1919 also created an office of High Commissioner. Now we know that the Government of India Act 1858 created what is called as the Secretary of State, who is responsible for the Indian affairs. But in addition to the Secretary of State, the Government of India Act 1919 created an office of High Commissioner, and this office of High Commissioner took up some of the functions of the Secretary of State. But although still who is responsible for the Indian administration is the Secretary of State, who is a cabinet minister in the British cabinet. But apart from that, a new authority was created, the Indian High Commissioner. And what is the High Commissioner responsibility? Especially to take care of the Indian students studying in UK and certain other matters related to trade. So all those things was taken up by the Indian High Commissioner. And this is one new development that has happened in the Government of India Act 1919. And apart from that, the Government of India Act 1919 also provided for a provision that after the implementation of this Government of India Act 1919, 10 years after its implementation, a commission will be set up to study how this act has performed. Whether this act has led to the development, whether this act has led to the more representation of the Indians in the system of governance. So all these things will be studied, and appropriately they will provide the recommendation based on which the new set of law will be passed or the new set of reforms will be passed. In fact, it is only based on this particular provision in 1927, a commission was appointed to study as to how the Government of India Act 1919 has performed, is basically what is called as the Simon Commission. In fact, why 1927? Because the Act says that it should have been appointed only after 10 years. But however, even before 10 years, even 2 years before the completion of the said time, the Simon Commission was appointed to study the basis of the Government of India Act 1919. And then the Simon Commission has given its report in 1930, and which formed the basis of next set of reform or next set of law that you are going to see is the Government of India Act 1935. So the Government of India Act 1935 was formulated mainly on the basis of recommendation which is given by the Simon Commission. So now let us enter and we will see as to what happened in the Government of India Act 1935. But before going into the Government of India Act 1935, when the Simon Commission was appointed in 1927, there was a lot of protest against the Simon Commission by the Indians. And why this protest happened? And they protested to send back the Simon Commission. In fact, go back Simon was the propaganda that was there when the Simon Commission was appointed. And one important reason for this go back Simon protest against the Simon Commission is because of the reason that the Simon Commission had no Indian representatives or no Indian members. So in the opinion of the Indians, any commission you appoint to study the functioning of the Government of India Act 1919, which would form the basis for the further reform, should also have the Indian members or the Indian representatives, but basically there were no Indian representatives in the Simon Commission. So that is the reason as to why there was a protest. So now let us get into the next set of reforms, that is the Government of India Act 1935, which was drafted and which came into effect based on the recommendation which is given by the Simon Commission. So before I get into the Government of India Act 1935, so what are the major changes that has been brought in the Government of India Act 1919? First of all, that they introduced what is called as a system of diarchy. Even before we understand the system of diarchy, the other major change is that there was a demarcation of subjects between the province and the center. And in the diarchy, there was something which is called as transfer list and reserve list. And they also brought in a system of what is called as bicameralism. And apart from bicameralism, they also introduced what is called as a system of direct election. And apart from that, they also brought in what is called as Public Service Commission, both for the center as well as the state. They also introduced a new office, what is called as Indian High Commissioner. And apart from that, most importantly, they expanded the scope of what is called as communal electorate. So these are all some of the major changes, and each and every point that I discussed can be asked in the prelims examination. So keep this in your mind. So the next set of reform is what is called as the Government of India Act 1935. Very, very important. Most of the times questions from the historical background in the prelims examination or in any of the competitive examination, they are likely to come from the Government of India Act 1919 and the Government of India Act 1935. So what are the major changes in the Government of India Act 1935? First and foremost development that has happened in the Government of India Act 1935 is it has provided for what is called as a All India Federation. That means for the first time during the British administration, the federal principle was brought into the system of administration. What do you understand by the federal principle? So federal principle means that there is a division of powers between the center and the state, and that division of power is recognized in the constitution itself or in the government of, at that point of time it is the Government of India Act 1935 that served as a constitution. So the Government of India Act 1935 clearly spelled out and demarcated as to what are the subjects of the center and what are the subjects of the state. What are the areas on which the central legislature can make laws and what are the areas on which the state legislature can make laws. So you can ask me, sir, this was there in the previous act itself. This was there in the Government of India Act 1919 itself. So what is the difference here? I have categorically said in the Government of India Act 1919, it was only devolution of power. That means if the Viceroy wanted to take away some of the subjects from the provinces, he is empowered to take it away. But that is not possible as per the Government of India Act 1935. The Act itself says as to what are the subjects of the provinces and what are the subjects of what is called as the center. And hence that is guaranteed in the Government of India Act 1935. Even the Viceroy does not have the power to disturb all those things. And that is why we say that the federation came into effect by the Government of India Act 1935. So first is All India Federation. And this All India Federation would consist of what? This All India Federation would consist of both the provinces as well as the princely states. So both will be part of it. And on top of that, there was demarcation of subjects. There was division of subjects between the provinces and the centers. And these subjects were broadly divided into three types of list. What were the three types of list as per the Government of India Act 1935? Which is a federal list, which means this is the power of the central legislature to make laws. And then they have what is called as a provincial list. This is the power of the provincial legislature to make laws. And then they have what is called as the concurrent list. This is the power of both the federal as well as the provincial legislature to make laws. This is similar to that of the union list, the state list and the concurrent list in the present constitution. Now instead of the word federal, we are using the union list. Instead of the word provincial, we are using the word state list. And the name for the concurrent list is even today is the concurrent list. And apart from that, there was also certain residuary powers which was entrusted in the hands of the Viceroy. This is also asked in the examination. What is this residuary power? If any of the subject matter is not mentioned in any of the three lists, and it is not mentioned in the federal list, it is not mentioned in the provincial list, or it is not mentioned in the concurrent list, then who will have the power to make laws is the Viceroy. So we already seen if a subject matter is mentioned in the union list, that is the federal list, the federal legislature, that is the central legislature. Mentioned in the provincial list, the provincial legislature can make laws. Concurrent list, both can make. And if some matter is not mentioned in any of the three lists, who will have the default power to make laws? It is the Viceroy. That is basically what you'll have to understand. And another important development that has happened in line with the federation, in line with an All India Federation or a federal principle, is that the provinces were given autonomy because certain subject matters were given to the provinces. So the provincial legislature will make the laws in those areas and the provincial executive will administer those areas. So to that extent, the autonomy has been given to the provinces. So this is again a major development that has happened during this particular thing. And in the provinces, basically all these subjects, the administration of these subjects will be carried out by the responsible ministers. Now try to understand, at that point of time there is already direct elections, because direct elections came in the Government of India Act 1919 itself, and that was carried forward in the Government of India Act 1935. So the responsible ministers would carry out the administration on whatever subject matters that has been given to the provinces. So that is again a major development. So these are all some of the major development that has happened in the Government of India Act 1935. But one major thing that you have to understand is the Government of India Act 1935 abolished the diarchy in the provinces. The Government of India Act 1919 brought in diarchy in the provinces, but that was abolished in 1935 because diarchy proved to be a very failure model. So diarchy means basically dividing the subject matter which was given to the provinces into reserved and transferred. But however, this system did not work well, and hence the Simon Commission recommended for its abolition, and later that was abolished in the Government of India Act 1935. So if you see that the major developments that has happened in the Government of India Act 1935, majorly for the first time the All India Federation was allowed, and that federation would consist of both the provinces as well as the princely states. We already understood as to what is a British province and what is a princely state. We have seen that in the first lecture. And apart from that, we also understand that there was also provincial autonomy which was given. When I say All India Federation, means certain subjects were given to the provinces. So they created a federal list, a provincial list, and what is called as a concurrent list. And apart from that, the provinces were empowered to carry out administration in those areas. Now this is all fine. But apart from all these things, if you look into the Government of India Act 1935, still a lot of powers were entrusted in the hands of the Viceroy. So Viceroy is sitting in the center. So he will have a lot of veto powers over the laws that can be made by the provinces. The Viceroy also had emergency powers, which is also there in the Indian Constitution. And by using his emergency powers, he can directly take up the control of some of the administration in some of the provinces. So all these powers were given to the provinces, in the hands of the Viceroy. So that is why basically there was an element of criticism that despite the provincial autonomy that was given to the provinces, still the Viceroy continued to exercise a lot of powers which is given under the Government of India Act 1935. And most importantly, the Government of India Act 1935 provided for what is called as an All India Federation. But this federation or this model never came into existence in reality. And why it has never came into existence in reality? Because as a part of the All India Federation, the provinces, not just the provinces, the princely states will also be there. But the princely states were not willing to join this particular federation. And as per this particular act, at least 50% of the princely states at that point of time has to approve this. But the princely states did not approve this, and hence this federation actually did not come into existence, but the act has provided for it. So this is a basic point that you'll have to keep in your mind. And apart from that, what are the other important developments that has happened? One is that they have introduced what is called as bicameralism even in the provinces. Now remember, we have seen that the bicameralism was introduced by the Government of India Act 1935, but bicameralism was initially brought in only in the central legislature. But today, after the Government of India Act 1935, bicameralism was also extended to the provinces. Say for example, today in the state legislature, if the states want, they can have what is called as legislative assembly and the legislative council. So similarly, at that point of time, they allowed bicameralism for the state legislature as well. And to that, some of the states are also having bicameralism. Okay, so this is basically you will have to understand. And then apart from that, they extended the principle of direct election. When was direct election brought in? Government of India Act 1919, and that was further extended, and which means basically Government of India Act 1935 also provided for direct election, but however this time the people who can vote was extended. What was limited in Government of India Act 1919, still the limitation was there, because still here it is based on the principle of limited adult franchise, but more and more people were also accommodated. So the number of or percentage of people who are eligible to vote was still increased in the Government of India Act 1935. And then apart from that, they kept on extending the principle of what is called a separate electorate. So we already seen that the principle of separate electorate was introduced by the Indian Council Act of 1909, expanded its scope in 1919, further expanded its scope in 1935. That means the Britishers continued with that divide and rule policy. They did not stop this. So this is also another major development. And apart from that, the Government of India Act 1935 provided for establishment of what is called as Federal Public Service Commission, Provincial Public Service Commission and also what is called as Joint Public Service Commission. This is a recent addition. So in the Government of India Act 1919, they provided for what is called as Central Public Service Commission, which is now renamed as the Federal Public Service Commission. And then they also provided for Provincial Public Service Commission, which continued as a Provincial Public Service Commission. And apart from that, the new addition here is the Joint Public Service Commission. That means 2 or more provinces can have a Joint Public Service Commission. That was also allowed as a part of the Government of India Act 1935. So these are the major developments that has happened during the Government of India Act 1935. If I have to summarize, first and foremost, you should understand the Government of India Act 1935 provided for what is called as an All India Federation. And that federation would consist of both the provinces as well as the princely states. But however, this federation never came into existence because of resistance from the princely states. That's a different story, but the Act provided for it. And in line with the All India Federation, certain subject matters were given to the provinces in the Act itself. And to that extent, the states were given autonomy, or the provinces were given autonomy to carry out administration in all these areas. And in line with provincial autonomy, the system of diarchy was also done away with in the provinces. But the Government of India Act 1935 provided for a system of diarchy in the center, but it was done away with in the provinces. And apart from that, other major developments include that they continued with the principle of direct election, expanded the scope of adult franchise, they continued or they extended the principle of bicameralism to the provinces as well. And of course, they continued and they expanded the principle of what is called as communal electorate. And they also brought in a new commission, what is called as a Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. So these are all some of the development that has happened during the Government of India Act 1935. Very, very important. Say for example, when was a direct election introduced? That is very important. You should know that what is this principle of diarchy, when it was introduced, when it was abolished, when bicameralism was introduced, when it was expanded. So these are all some of the questions that is repeatedly being asked in the prelims examination. But despite all these things, there were some element of criticism to the Government of India Act 1935. One is basically this scheme of federation never came into existence because of the stiff resistance from what is called as the princely states. Second is the very objective of this All India Federation is to give more autonomy to the provinces. But on the one hand, you are saying that you are giving more autonomy to the provinces, but on the other hand, you are giving more powers in the hands of the Viceroy, including the powers of the Viceroy to veto the bills passed by the provincial legislature, including the powers of the Viceroy to impose emergency in the provinces and thereby take up the control or thereby to take up control over the administration in the provinces. So on the one hand, you are giving the power, on the other hand, you are empowering the Viceroy to do away all those things. So these are all some of the criticism as per this particular act. So which the critics were also critical of. Anyways, so this is a critical part. Now we'll move into the next important development that has happened in the Indian Independence Act 1947. So after 1935, that is the Government of India Act 1935, the British India was governed as per the Government of India Act 1935. And during this particular stage, before the Indian Independence Act, we know as to how the Constituent Assembly was established and what was the story behind that. So the Constituent Assembly was established based on the Cabinet Mission Plan. 1946, the Constituent Assembly was established. But however, the Constituent Assembly was not very active. Although they met on 9th December 1946, it was not very active unless and until independence was given. And India was given independence in 1947. 15th August 1947, India was given independence based on the act that was passed by the British Parliament, and that is nothing but the Indian Independence Act. The Indian Independence Act did not provide any mechanism as to how India is to be governed. The Indian Independence Act only gave independence to India. It gave independence to India and it also made the Constituent Assembly of India a sovereign body to make or to draft the constitution as it wishes. So therefore, as per this particular constitution, India will be governed. So try to remember this in your mind, that even after independence, which came in 1947, India did not have a constitution immediately because the Constituent Assembly of India was working in drafting the constitution. And that constitution became a reality only in 1950. But we became independent in 1947. So 1947 till 1950, still India was governed based on the Government of India Act 1935. And when India became independent, we continued to be governed as per the Government of India Act 1935. And when we had our constitution in 1950, and henceforth India was governed based on the Constitution of India. So again I am repeating it, the Indian Independence Act 1947 did not provide any mechanism as to how India is to be governed, but it only said that you are independent, now your Constituent Assembly is also a sovereign body to draft your own constitution. So, but till that time the constitution was framed by the Constituent Assembly, India continued to be governed based on the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935. So, what are the important provisions of the Indian Independence Act is what we'll have to understand. So, first of all, the Indian Independence Act ended the British rule. It gave independence to India. Not only independence to India, it also created a separate state of Pakistan through this particular act. And if you see one of the important provisions of the Indian Independence Act, the act allowed the princely state to either join with India or with Pakistan, or if they want to remain independent, they can remain independent also. In fact, most of the princely states, except for some of the princely states, they all joined with India. And some of the princely states, they remain to choose independence separately. One such example is the Jammu and Kashmir. But you might know the story of Jammu and Kashmir, although they continue to remain independent. After independence, soon after independence, they came and they joined with India through what is called as an instrument of accession. And in the history, even today, that considered to be very controversial. But however, yes, Jammu and Kashmir joined with India. And then Hyderabad joined with India. They also remained independent after the commencement of the constitution. So this is because of the provisions of the Indian Independence Act 1947. And apart from this, the Indian Independence Act, as I already said, that made the Constituent Assembly of India a sovereign body. To what extent it is a sovereign body? Sovereign body means it's a complete authority or it is a supreme authority. It made the Constituent Assembly of India a sovereign body to the extent that the Constituent Assembly of India is free to draft its own constitution as it wishes, based on which India would be governed in the future. And to that extent, it was a sovereign body. But however, one thing that you have to keep in your mind is the Indian Independence Act has provided only a dominion status to India. So what does it mean by dominion status? So dominion status is little short of what is called as full independence or complete independence, which means India would continue to be a semi-independent political entity or a semi-independent body or a semi-independent country, which means they have complete authority over the internal matters, whatever happens within India, but still India would consider the British monarch as the head of the state. And the British monarch may be represented by some of the other authority also. So this is basically what is called as the idea of dominion. In fact, you will understand even after India became independent, who continued to be the head of the state? It was a Governor General. It was a Governor General who continued to be the head of the state, who is basically a representative of the British monarch. So this is basically what is called as the concept of dominion. But then India has done away with this particular dominion status once it had its own constitution. And the moment we had our constitution, which came into force on 26 January 1950, then we no longer considered the British monarch or any of their representatives as the head of the state. So this is basically what you will have to understand by dominion status. And this act also abolished the office of Viceroy. So till this point of time, who is carrying out the administration in India, the office of Viceroy, and he was renamed. The office of Viceroy was again renamed as the Governor General of India. And he continued to be the head of the state. Basically, he was representing the British Crown, and because of the dominion status. So that is what you will have to understand. But however, try to understand that this Governor General, who would be representing the British Crown, would be appointed by the British Crown, but on the advice of the Dominion Cabinet. That means in India, there would be a cabinet ministers, and these cabinet ministers will advise, on whose advice the Crown would appoint the Governor General, who would be the head of the state on behalf of the British Crown. So these are all basic development that has happened, and this Indian Independence Act also has taken away the veto powers of the British Crown with regard to the bills passed by the Dominion legislature. So these are all the major developments that has happened during the Indian Independence Act. So basically Indian Independence Act gave independence to India, made it a dominion authority, and apart from that it made the Indian Constituent Assembly a sovereign body to make or to draft the constitution as it wishes, and made the princely states free whether they want to they had an option of to be free or to join with India or Pakistan. So these are all the major provisions. Now the Indian Constituent Assembly was a sovereign body because of Indian Independence Act, and the Constituent Assembly drafted its constitution, and that constitution was adopted by the Constituent Assembly, and it came into force on 26 January 1950, and thereby India became a republic, and no longer India was a dominion, no longer it had this particular dominion status. So this is the basic understanding you should have with regard to the historical background, and that ends with the Government of India Act 1940, ends with the Indian Independence Act of 1947. So now let us go to the last part of the lecture, that is the practice question. So if you have listened to the lecture, I am very sure that you will be able to answer this particular question, and we are completely coming to the end of the historical background, both the company rule as well as the crown rule, which ended with the Indian Independence Act. So come to this particular question. In the federation established by the Government of India Act 1935, residuary powers were given to whom? So to whom the residuary powers were given? To the federal legislature, governor general, provincial legislature, provincial governors. Now try to understand, even in the examination sometimes the viceroy is also interchangeably called as the governor general. Now keeping that in mind, you can answer this particular question, and you can put the answers in the comment box. So with that we are coming to the end of what is called as the historical background. So in the next lecture what we will do is, whatever things we have covered, we will do a practice. In the sense, we will do a lot of practice questions. We will try to solve the practice question, which will again give a lot of clarity with regard to whatever we have discussed. Remember, to clear the examination, it is not only that you will read, but you should also practice, and that is when your application becomes easier. So practice will help you to do well in the examination. So we will do practice also after covering certain areas in the syllabus. So with that we are coming to the end of this particular lecture, and I would humbly request all of you to refer this particular channel to any of your friends and family members who are preparing for the UPSC IAS examination or other competitive examination, and I am very sure that this will be really helpful to them. So thank you very much, all the very best. We will meet again with the next lecture. Thank you.